Hey everybody, this is Bad at Keeping Secrets. I'm Carissa, obviously, and this is Meghan O'Rourke. I found out about her book, The Invisible Kingdom, when I read religiously the New York Times book review. And basically this book has been everywhere for me once I heard about it. I don't know how many times you have to hear about something for it to stick, but this one I feel like got me at the beginning, both because I feel like it's a conversation that we desperately need to have about how healthcare needs to change, what healthcare is, if care should be coupled with health in regards to referencing the current system we have. And also because I have a daughter who has cystic fibrosis, and this is actually Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month. And so I think the subtitle Reimagining Chronic Illness also fits something very close to my heart at the moment. So thank you so much for writing this book and talking with me, and welcome. You also are the editor at the Yale Review, and you teach there as well, correct?
Yeah. Welcome. I mean, not welcome. I'm tired. You can tell. Hi, thank you for having me, is what I'm trying to say.
No, it's funny because last week I had Jess Gross on, and we talked about her book, Screaming on the Inside. And it's both of us right now we have little people that we're trying to care for and tend to, and oftentimes sleep.
And Jess was my deputy at Double X. I hired Jess many years ago to work with me at Double X, which was a magazine that grew out of Slate. So she is an old colleague of mine.
Well, I feel really lucky to somehow be in the same world with the both of you. But I just kind of wanted to start out something I think as a visual artist that I feel like I can relate to, or something that I think a lot about, is finding meaning through suffering. And I think that for me, when I look at your poetry and your memoirs, I mean, would you consider this part memoir?
Definitely. Yeah.
There's a lot of it's both creating because it's your practice, but it's trying to locate meaning in uncertainty. And I just kind of wanted to start the conversation off with asking you about how or why you write, or how it functions for you in your life.
I love that question as a starting place, because that is really the starting place of this, isn't it? Is, why there's the kind of autobiographical reason why this book exists, but then there's this deeper, almost spiritual, existential reason this book exists, which is that I just need to write. And that started, when I was young. I think I write in order to understand things that resist being understood. But I will couple that by saying, by understanding, I don't mean having certainty. I more mean understanding the specific textures of my uncertainty, understanding the things about experience that are actually quite hard to put into words in transactional language that I might use talking to a friend, or even talking to a doctor in the doctor's office. And that it has always seemed to me that writing, either poetry or narrative nonfiction, actually makes this space for more complexity, right? I feel like when I'm teaching writing, I'm always saying, well, don't summarize so much, don't conclude so much, actually lean into what can't be known, try to articulate what's not known. That's the task of writing in some way for me. The experience of experience rather than the experience itself, in some sense. So yeah, I think, is that really vague? I hope that was somewhat clear.
Oh no, it made me think of a lot of different tangents to go off of. I think one of the classic art school thing to say is oh, you are an artist because you can't do anything else. And I feel like writing to understand really makes sense of that. I interviewed not too long, actually 2 years ago, Jericho Brown, and he talked about his process of writing poetry, as one of which he just let himself go into a flow state and see what came and then try to make sense of it. And I was wondering, since you do kind of this more journalistic memoir style, and then also embedded in the invisible kingdom, there's a lot of poetry and beautiful prose. And I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship of those two forms coexisting.
That's such a great question. I mean, Jericho, who's a friend, is right that so much of writing really is about letting oneself go into a flow state. I think after reading a lot, right? So that you have these kind of embedded forms. But you're right to surmise, as I think you are, that in this book there might have had to be a little bit more kind of intentionality, even something like an outline, which I usually resist having. And in fact, what I did do for this book was that I knew from the beginning it would be wedding a much more immersive, sort of lyric memoir with really quite a lot of research and reporting, that it is a little bit more journalistic and does use a different part of my brain to get on the page. And I wanted those things to coexist because I felt that you couldn't understand my story, that I couldn't understand my story without some of that research. But you also couldn't understand my story if it was just research and journalism, because you wouldn't have the kind of poetic moments that I hope really animate and make intimate some of the lived experience of chronic illness, which is so hard to convey. So it would sort of toggle. The process of writing was this very odd one of, excuse me, but toggling between sort of the outline-based research and knowing I had to get that on the page, which I will be the first to tell you is the harder part for me. And then the really, for me, enjoyable, even when it's excavating something painful, work of much more kind of digging deep inside and seeing what comes out, like trying to articulate something, getting into that flow state and realizing, oh, this is what I wish I'd said in that doctor's office. This is what I feel about medical gaslighting. This is what I feel about having an invisible illness.
Maybe let's start a little bit with talking about your story, and how the sort of fascination or the will to try to understand, and maybe not, I think it's important, not fix, how to live with, how to cope with kind of what you've experienced.
Yeah, so my story is hard to tell because it's a messy one. So I try to summarize it by saying,
I smile because the best stories are messy.
I know, right? And it's like I'm always like, how do I tell this so people can hear it? Which is sort of the question that animates the book. But I got very sick I got sick in my 20s and then very sick in my 30s. I don't know when I got sick. I don't know if I was always sick. I don't know if I got sick, but I at first began going to doctors and receiving really no answers and hearing, maybe you're stressed, maybe it's anxiety, maybe, you're just kind of a hypochondriac, et cetera. And I was stressed and I did experience anxiety. So I took those answers at face value. And I really didn't realize for more than a decade that I really did have some serious illnesses going on. And over time, when I did realize something was wrong after going on a roller coaster of symptoms, it included things like really profound fatigue, right? So it's hard to pin down, but it was deep and profound. It wasn't sleepiness or not sleeping. It was just something else, like a cellular breakdown. Brain fog, terrible electric shocks that would roam my body, joint pain, just all this host of strange symptoms that would come and go. And even at the point where I realized, okay, something's going on, I still was looking for like that one answer, kind of, and that one treatment that was going to get me better, or just like the medication I would take to manage it. And I think the book is really about, in a way, becoming kind of radicalized in my response to my own body, our healthcare system, how we think about health and well-being, and how we think about illness and suffering and value, into realizing that like whatever was going on with me was way more complex than a single diagnosis or a single pill could ever fix. And it was going to be something I was going to live with that would force me to reimagine my life, but also force me to reimagine what I thought illness was in the first place and its role in our society.
Maybe since you stopped there was so many things to talk about. But since you stopped there, can we maybe let's pick up with what you kind of think, how you would define health and well-being at this moment after doing all of your research and having your lived experience.
Yeah. Well, I would define health and well-being, I think, really separately at this point, right? I would say right now I have an incredible sense of well-being in my life. I'm not exactly fully healthy in the normative sense of the word, right? But how can I put it? I guess I really this is so naive, but I really didn't understand and hadn't thought at all about chronic illness. I just somehow thought you get sick, you get better when you're young, or, I was worried about things like cancer, things like that. But I just really didn't imagine or have a framework for thinking about getting sick and staying sick in a way that would impair my life, but not, you know, mean that I had a terminal illness, right? And I think that one of the things that I had, and then once I did get a series of diagnoses, so I got, I should say, a diagnosis of tick-borne illness, I got an autoimmune disease diagnosis. I ended up in the very end with a diagnosis of something called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic condition that can underpin and kind of exacerbate some of these other situations with post-infectious or infectious diseases. Anyway, when I first got the diagnosis, I really thought, okay, I'm going to do all the therapies they're asking me to do, and I'm going to, just like somehow dream up this magic diet that I'm reading about online. I'm going to do that. And then like, somehow I will get better. Like I really had this belief that just somehow I was still going to get back to some idea of health that I had. And I think to your question, what I had to realize was that I was never going to get better in the way I had used the word before I got sick. I would get better in some ways, that my symptoms would, abate, and in particular, I would find the joys of life restored to me. And I guess that's where the well-being part comes in, because it's really interesting to me that, I have a better sense of my health limitations now than I've ever had. I still have some major limitations, but there's something about the journey that I went on and the fact that I got quite a lot of medical help in the end that has left me with some sense of well-being, even though I'm going through this. I always have to say, when I was really sick, I felt like people around me wanted me to kind of experience my sickness with grace, and to kind of like find the spiritual meaning in it. And when I was really sick, that was completely outside of my capabilities, right? And that's sort of a distinction I want to make, is that I think we have to be really thoughtful about how we ask and expect people who are sick to deal with their sickness.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the expectations, the sort of spiritual expectations that people placed upon you?
Yeah, some of this came up in my reading, but it also came up with a visit from a friend that I write about in my last chapter, which is called the wisdom narrative, because I realized at one point that two things. Well, I realized like, oh, I'm not really supposed to talk about being sick, right? I'm supposed to just pretend I'm not sick, even though everyone knows I'm sick. But like, no one really in my life wanted to hear about my symptoms. But then, to the degree that they did, they would often kind of act as though I should be ennobled by my illness, right? Or kind of suffer my sickness with some kind of spiritualized grace, which interestingly is a concept that comes in even in some of the better sociology on illness and illness narratives. There's a book by Arthur Kleinman where it's a very famous book. It's often taught in med schools, and he sort of looks at the sociology of illness narratives. But at one point he says, of someone that he was kind of annoyed that this patient didn't really live with her illness with grace. And I remember being like, we can't ask this of people, especially in a society where we're not supporting, chronically ill people with disability insurance, actual disability, or whatever, all the things that structurally we need to change, and better healthcare. So I just felt like this notion kept cropping up in my life. I had a friend come visit, and I was saying, I was having a really hard time, which you quickly learn not to say. But I said it in this case, and she was like, well, but think about all the things your illness taught you. Think about how much of a like kind of better person you've become, how much you've grown. And I said, well, yeah, but I would rather not have learned these things, which is the truth people don't necessarily want to hear. I did learn them, like something came out of it, but I wouldn't go back and choose it. And we were supposed to say, oh, I wouldn't have it any other way. Well, actually, I would have it the other way.
Oh, no, totally. And I think especially, can we talk a little bit, this leads me to the sort of invisible, the term invisible, that sort of, uh, again, has been really challenging. I mean, obviously for lots of people, otherwise this book wouldn't have resonated so deeply. But I think in the book, you talk about how the importance of having ailments being believed, and how when Western medicine can't sort of quantify them, it becomes a psychological or a mental issue that then becomes the individual's fault in some ways. It's a weird cycle. That's, again, I'm way oversimplifying it.
No, I think you really captured it in wonderfully simple terms that are helpful, which is, it really does seem to me in my research, because I did interview a lot of people, quite bore out for me that, we live in a very technological, evidence-based system that brings with it our longer lives and much better diagnosis, much better care, just all these better things come with it. The one downside, or a major downside, as several, medical professors themselves said to me, is that when there's an area which we don't understand well, we don't have easy tools for measuring a condition or differentiating it from others, what all too often happens is the people living with that condition go unbelieved, and in fact experience what we now call medical gaslighting, right? Where you have fatigue, you have brain fog. These are vague symptoms, vague words, or non-medical words, right? In a certain way. And so you're told, oh, this is anxiety. This is, especially if you're a young woman, this is psychiatric in origins. The problem becomes you, right? Not the medical system's lack of knowledge. And that really matters, because then the person takes that into themselves, and that narrative becomes part of their illness journey, right? So in my case, I just really internalized that idea that there was something wrong with me, that I just didn't know how to live right. And so there were two invisible things, right? One was the disease, which was invisible, and then one was the ways in which my words were rendered invisible by encounters with medicine. And I often say, there were two forms of suffering. There was the illness, and then the silence that I was met with, the ways in which I was rendered invisible. And it was not the illness, but it was that being rendered invisible that was the thing that was the most challenging. That was the thing that almost killed me. And so I really wrote the book to help the many of us who live with these conditions be seen and heard at last, because I'll tell you a funny story. So I was really, really sick for like 10 years, and like really sick, barely could walk around the block, but I would go to doctor's office. They'd be like, your cholesterol looks great, you're fine. And then when I was pregnant with my first son, I was on a drug to, because I have all this autoimmune stuff, they had put me on this antibiotic and this also steroids, and I had an allergic reaction to something. Mm-hmm. But we didn't know what. But the allergic reaction meant that I had like a rash that started on my face and ended up all down my body, and it was very, very visible. Okay, so the rash was really itchy and annoying. It was scary insofar as I was like, is it going to affect my baby? But it was really, after all that I had gone through, the brain fog, which was awful, the fatigue, which was awful, it was like a minor nuisance. I walk into the doctor's office, the nurses are like, oh my God, you poor thing. The doctor, oh my God, you poor thing. I soon had like 5 doctors around me, all trying to help me figure out what this rash was. And it was nothing in the end. It was like a mild allergic reaction to something, but it was just such a striking example of like how different symptoms are treated differently, and how also women's bodies are treated differently. Because I was pregnant, it was taken much more seriously than if I hadn't been. And also because it was visible, it was elicited all the sympathy and attention that if I had just been like, I'm so tired, even though that was the more debilitating symptom, that would never have gotten that response.
Yeah, pregnancy is a trip. I've seen, I think before I was pregnant, I believed that I had a certain amount of control or ability to affect change. And pregnancy really put that in a bit. I understand that it's really important to feel a certain amount of agency in life, but boy, the change things I want to talk a little bit about the interconnectedness of both the systems or in our bodies, but also us as humans in terms of our nervous systems. Could you kind of talk a little bit? And my question is going to be about stress and the relationship of stress to the functions of different systems in our body, our susceptibility potentially to illness and viruses, and then also how, and again, maybe we should stop there and then I'll ask the second part after maybe you talk a little bit more about stress.
Sure.
I feel like,
yeah.
Oh, I would say that, like, I feel like every time I go to the doctor, I mean, in the last, I don't know, seems like what forever, all of my ailments have been the root cause is stress. And
yeah, exactly. You know, look, I mean, stress is this was actually, I read a lot about stress in the book. There's one chapter that sort of tackles this, and implicitly too, also, I think, depression and mental outlooks in general. But this was one of the hardest parts of the book to write because, like, well, look, clearly stress has an impact on our bodies, right? And the fact that we're acknowledging that in 21st century medicine is a great improvement over a past in which it was completely unacknowledged, right? So we want stress to be in the picture somewhere. What's kind of funny or ironic to me is that, like, now everything is just like stress. Like, we can't figure out what's wrong with you. It must be stress. Well, what, but why? What's the physiological mechanism? Like, is there a physiological mechanism, right? Let's really drill down. That kind of drilling down an intellectual curiosity was what seemed so strangely absent. It was like stress was this magic word that the doctor could say to end the appointment and get to the next patient, right? But I was like, but why? What's going on? And finally, I saw this really great doctor who was like, well, sure, stress. She was like, but is it the stress of an untreated, really dangerous infection? She's like, I think it's probably more likely to be that than like you're stressed running to catch your bus every morning, you know? So what I found writing the book and doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people is that we just don't know. We don't really understand what stress does. There's a few things we can point to. One is that clearly the so-called mind or the brain and the body are deeply interconnected. The other thing that's deeply interconnected that we didn't understand until recently is the nervous system and the immune system. So it used to be thought that these were two totally separate systems, but through a series of really elegant studies, they've shown deep connections between the nervous system and the immune system. So your nervous system obviously helps trigger the certain kinds of antibodies. Like, let's say it helps trigger a whole coordinated series of immune responses. But it's also the case that it can do things like, if you've had allergic responses in the past and you look at a food, your nervous system is priming your body to respond in a certain way because of what it knows about from the past, right? So there's these fascinating studies of allergies that show you can really coax children's immune systems to stop going into producing anaphylactic shock from peanuts. But once you just show them the peanut and tell them now they're going to eat it, their system will go back into anaphylactic shock. Whereas if you give it to them without telling them, they won't have anaphylactic shock. So there's clearly like this just deeply entwined thing that does suggest that what we expect to happen and what does happen, there is a connection, right? But it doesn't mean that all illness originates in your head too. The other thing we know is that the more chronic stress you experience, as opposed to independent high levels of stress, like the example everyone uses is that we used to be chased by a lion, and our body was used to like producing a lot of antibodies in case you got wounded by the lion, and then the antibodies would rush and heal the wound. But now we experience chronic stress, so this coordinated dance of immune cells, they go up, they go down, they go back up again is what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have more immune cells, then you're supposed to have suppressed immune system, I think, and then it goes back to normal. That's what's supposed to happen. The more you do it, the more likely mistakes occur, and then you get stuck in these kind of erroneous cycles. So there is a way in which chronic stress can kind of lead to be implicated in autoimmune disease. We know adverse childhood events mean that you're more likely to have an autoimmune disease. So there's a lot of implications about this kind of intertwined dance. But what's so frustrating is that, you go to a doctor and it's all just like stress. Well, but what? We need to a lot more research. We need to understand. We need to look at the physiology of this.
It also seems like really counterproductive for our
Totally.
our bodies to sort of collect to collect these sort of like additional hardships, I guess you could say. There was something you
Yeah.
talked about in the book about our immune response being sort of a history of our sort of interactions with our environment and our genetics. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah. You know, the immune system is so complicated, and I'm not even going to summarize it well or accurately. I'm sure any of your listeners who are medical professionals will be like, no, no, no. But I just remember feeling like I wish I had known more about my immune system from when I was a kid, because it's this incredibly beautiful thing that we have that does become a kind of personalized record. And that's because we have different elements of the immune system. One is innate and we're born with it. And then one really is, our ant shows up in the form of our antibodies and cells that are created in our bone marrow and our thymus that become a record of our exposure over time. And those cells come out kind of naive, like young children, and then they get educated by their encounters with novelty and with pathogens and foreign matter. And they learn to sort of specialize like a graduate student in an area that they become like the COVID-19 antibody, they become the flu antibody, and they get very specialized. And so that's why our immune systems really, I think, become this powerful metaphor for the ways in which, I think I was raised to feel and to think that sickness was this very individual experience, this very autonomous, isolated experience. And that, in fact, when I got sick, that I was responsible for my sickness, right? In this kind of American, hyper individualistic way. And I remember reading all this and being like, well, no, if I have an autoimmune disease, it's not a reflection on me and like bad choices I've made as a person. It's a reflection of something about our society's, way of regulating chemicals and how we process food and just all of this history of interactions that my body has had with other people and places and things that has led to things going wrong, and that it's like a profoundly social, the immune system is like a metaphor for our profound social interconnectedness in the end.
I think that was there were lots of like huge paradigm shifts or huge thinking shifts that happened throughout the book. But that one for me is really hard to break, to sort of let go of the responsibility and think of it more as a socialized problem or something, saying something about what our culture is going through at the moment.
Yeah.
I think for me, I wanted to ask you, because we only have a few more minutes. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the interconnectedness of illness and grief, and because I think they're speaking to both there's a giant sort of lack of, I even can't come up with the language on how to talk about them at this moment. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your attraction to them in this moment. And I know that sounds weird to be like attracted to exploring painful
I love
things.
that you actually love that you use that word, because I think I am attracted to exploring them and attracted to naming them as almost certainly inevitable experiences of humanity, right? I mean, that most of us undergo illness and most of us undergo grief, and often in an entangled way. So as you know, my last book was about grief. I wrote it after my mother died, and I wrote it out of the same reason I wrote this, which is I thought, here's this subject that affects all of us and no one's really talking about it. We're having these kind of very American conversations where we talk about it, but we talk about it as this thing to kind of learn from and get through. And I'm really interested in my work in making space for the messier feelings and the messier realities, which I think we can also learn from, but aren't necessarily like tidily recuperative. And maybe learning from is not the word there. it's funny, I was just editing a piece that this writer was writing, and it's a friend of mine writing about failure that's just onto something so profound about how we just always want to turn failure into a stepping stone to success. But actually maybe failure is just like part of a process of living, right? And it's like thinking about, so anyway, thinking about grief and illness as processes. And what I would say is that one thing I just realized recently was that I didn't fully mourn my own illness until I got much better, that there was a way in which being really sick takes up a lot of time energetically, or taking care of someone really sick takes a lot of time energetically, like when I was taking care of my mother or my father. You're grieving in a certain way, but you're also, a lot of energetic work is going toward that caretaking, and grief kind of comes in at the edges and these shards. And it was only when I was, in a sense, not taking care of myself at that level, but getting much better, that I started to really feel grief at what had been lost and what had happened, you know? And then at another level, it was really only after this book came out and I started hearing from other, I'm going to actually tear up. It was really only when I started hearing from other people that I realized like how profoundly lonely and isolating the experience had been, because I had let it be, because our society lets it be, because we expect it to be. And I just feel so passionately that like we have to talk about these things and share these experiences, because I don't think these experiences are supposed to be isolating. I think they're so integral to our experience. They are baked into the condition of humanity, and they are the source of incredible meaning, painful meaning, but of incredible meaning. Yeah.
No,
So.
I mean, sorry, but thinking about like, or think about how it's, how sorry, Megan, I'm just a little speechless. But
No,
I think about it in reference to my daughter, but when I think about like the implications of someone saying they're in pain and shutting that down, being like
yeah.
societally acceptable. I think about this a lot in parenting, about all the things that I learned about parenting that seemed really natural, but then in practice are just really not considered, I guess.
Yeah.
Not critical, not when you're trying to tend to something really complicated and something unique. Having one size fits all answers, I mean, it's
Yeah.
really tidy and I want them, but I don't know if they actually are reflective of how reality works. And I think it's an exciting moment to bear witness to this time, where we can sort of reimagine
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
with data, with new skill sets, how we want to live and how we want to treat each other. I feel like after reading the book, I'm super hopeful about reimagining the possibilities of what Western healthcare can look like.
Yeah.
And also thinking about, I think a lot about healthcare in the context of society. I mean, not a lot, but I think about it frequently. We just got, I think it was last week, where my daughter, her drug, this drug that may or may not save her life, was approved for her age group.
Wow.
But there are all these like if and conditions and things like that surrounding it. So she isn't on it yet. And I've been having some pretty intense feelings around it, reactions, like extreme grief around it. And I've been trying to figure out like why that is, but also that why we should care about other people's health.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that people shouldn't care just out of a genuine altruism, but also out of a self-interest as
Totally.
well.
Totally. I mean, this is John Donne saying, "No man is an island." You know, we are all part of the main, and he doesn't just mean that I should care through empathy, but like we are just, it's just all interconnected. And you know, as you're talking about your daughter and I'm listening, I'm thinking about the term healthcare and how I think, especially as a parent, as a patient, I felt this, but my son has some chronic illness stuff too. And just when I have had to go to appointments with him, like the lack of the care in healthcare becomes so painful and apparent, even though it's also there, right? And it gets delivered in these surprising, beautiful, profound ways, like the extra act of kindness by the nurse drawing blood, the whatever it might be. When it's there, you know, you see it and you see the possibilities. And one thing I thought about is that we're not only we're not only harming ourselves as patients when we don't bring care into healthcare, but we're actually robbing doctors of the ethical dignity that I think many of them want to have, and that is kind of battered by a system of bureaucracy and 15-minute appointments and kind of, just this endless, kind of office work that doesn't get properly accounted for. I mean, just we make it so hard for healthcare to deliver care. But the thing that I found in my research is that the care part of healthcare, that is, materially matters. Like it has huge impacts on people's bodies. And this is the other sort of social space, is that our immune system really does turn out to be porous to other people's like affects and emotions, right? And a caring doctor ends up affecting some of her patients with chronic illness as profoundly as some of our best drugs in certain cases, right? Anyway, so, and then the other thing is that in a hyper-medicalized moment, I think it puts such a point on our uncertainty, and it makes so much sense to me that you would feel grief around this drug, because it's like there's these possibilities that may emerge, that might not emerge, and it just foregrounds again that for every step forward we take, there's so much we don't know, right? And, uncertainty is actually part of every life, right? None of us know how long we'll live, what will happen tomorrow, but it gets really raised as a principle that can be agonizing to live with, but I think also meaningful at times when a body is sick. Yeah.
I have two final questions for you. One is a selfish question, and then one is a question about the future, and as trite as it seems, what you're hopeful about happening and the potentials that life have, what wakes you up in the morning. One is, I remember when you were talking, it brought me back to one of our like hospital visits where Margaret's pulmonologist told me, don't worry about this. You don't remember anything from when you were 2. She's not going to remember anything from when she was 2. And I was just curious. This woman, I actually, she saved Margaret's life several times. I don't mean to like throw her under the bus, and she's super well intentioned. And I remember thinking, actually, these are these like primal memories that maybe her consciousness doesn't have access to. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that in regards to thinking about the immune system and the nervous system and how memory works in our bodies.
I have like the opposite response to the doctor, which is, like it's good that the conscious memories won't be there, right? I think that's probably a blessing, but it doesn't mean that, as you say, some primal work is not happening to her body, her memory. I mean, we know that adverse childhood events, remembered or not remembered, as far as I can tell, have an impact on your immune system. And in my own case, I've often thought about, I have this like very hyper vigilant nervous system. It just like likes to find danger everywhere. And there's really like, I can't point to an event in my childhood that would have primed it, except I learned late, in my 20s that when I was born, my mother had some kind of infection, and it was the 70s, and they didn't understand infections very well, and they didn't want me to get it. So they took me away from her and they put me in this like nursery, and I didn't see her for, I think, 8 days. And my father would come feed me and the nurses would give me bottles. But I sometimes just think, like, was that the moment where the hypervigilance got turned on? Because they were out of an abundance of caution, right? So I'm just speculating a poet here, but we just don't know, is what I guess I'm saying. And there's so much, and watching my own children, have had to believe that their bodies are, that there's a record of encounter, and then it changes as the brain changes and as memory does or doesn't change. But so yeah.
Thank you for indulging me on that. Okay, so back to the second part, the second half of that question, and then we'll close. But yeah, no, it sounds really silly to want to end on something you're excited
No.
about, but I feel like ever since I don't know, for a while, if we can find joy celebrating it, it's never a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, I've really become, it sounds so hokey, but I have so much become just a creature of the moment. Like I just relish the present because the present is what matters, right? And then the building up of multiple presents. And I guess my children are young and they change so much every day and my health changes all the time. So I really just drink in the deliciousness of the present in any way I can because yeah, I try to focus on that. I remember that's all anyone ever has. The other thing that is giving me hope, and it really is in the world of what's called complex chronic illness, like the kinds that I had, there's just a lot of movement happening in research. And I've spent the past few months reporting on a piece about long COVID and going to research centers at Harvard and talking to researchers is so cool. Like just in every area where they are doing research, there's so much good research happening. There's bad research too. There's politics, there's all that, but like there's amazing research happening in universities in America of all kinds of conditions and diseases. And when you are up close against it and you see those researchers, they have the intellectual curiosity that I was looking for. They have the passion, the commitment. And I have to say, I've just been like kind of geeking out on that. I just feel like this is so cool to get to meet these people, to see the work they're doing. And I just feel I always have to give people that message of there's people out there like doing the work that we all want to be done.
Thank you. It's really reassuring. I felt that way when I read your book. And I thought about shifting the narrative of like, oh, we're just gonna get better to living what life looks like and how these moments of joy, despite all the pain and suffering and uncertainty, can make it worth living.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Meghan.
Well,
Take care of yourself.
thank you for having me. Take care of yourself too.
My pleasure. Bye.